Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I just appreciate you watching. Today we are continuing our discussion of Bootstrap that we started last week in our pre-recorded lesson that we were looking at. We're going to be talking specifically about a part of Bootstrap, which is the grid system in Bootstrap, and just kind of spending a lot of time in demo, because I do think that is a big part of, kind of using these tools in general, is just kind of understanding, okay, well, how do we use these tools in practice? And, what exactly are we doing when we utilize these tools? So just basically, seeing the workflow and kind of understanding what's going on here is really going to help us out a lot. And so we're talking about the grid system specifically today, but just to kind of give ourselves some reminders about Bootstrap before we get going here. Bootstrap is a front-end framework, a CSS framework specifically, that's already done a bunch of, it already has a lot of our CSS done for us. And we saw that in some of the examples that were done for us last time, right? We built the standard basic website, and then just by the nature of putting in the link to the CDN where Bootstrap was hosted, it immediately changed the look and feel of our site without us having to do anything. Right? So we can take and make big changes really quickly using Bootstrap. And that is something that is significant. Right? And that was one of the big things that we talked about as we are using Bootstrap. That's one of the big things that we talked about in terms of a why we would use Bootstrap. Right? We talk about this idea of prototyping, the idea of rapid prototyping, being able to, come up with an application or a website and make it really quickly. And, sometimes we just want to get stuff out there, and we don't necessarily care about how it looks, just so long as it looks good. Right? And we can use something like Bootstrap or Tailwind, which is something that's very similar to Bootstrap, and have a good looking website within just, minutes. Right? And a lot of web developers and application developers, they've taken to using Bootstrap and similar frameworks over the years for that very reason, right? Like, it takes and it simplifies our styling process immensely. Even if you think, I'm not good at design, I don't really know what goes, I don't know what to use. Right, it kind of takes that decision fatigue out of the equation, because all of the decisions have been made for you by the people who created the framework. And so let's talk a little bit about the grid system here. Bootstrap's grid system in particular is built using Flexbox, and it is fully responsive. In some other classes, particularly Web 2.15, we talk about the differences between CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox, or Flex, right? Flex and Grid. And we say that Flexbox is basically a one-dimensional layout model, right, where we're basically just able to lay out, on the horizontal or on the vertical, whereas Grid basically gives us a two-dimensional, a columns and rows model, right? And in that class in Web 2.15, we actually we make our templates and we look at grid in that sort of way. But we are building on top of Flexbox here, which I do have a slide about Flexbox, so I am kind of getting ahead of myself just a little bit here. But this is going to make things a lot easier on us than traditional box model positioning than we might be accustomed to from Web 1.15, right? Where we are positioning things, relative or absolute or static or, what have you in relation to that. Right, because it's hard to make things responsive that way. It's difficult to get things to kind of play nicely with one another on your design that way. There's a lot of guessing and checking, a lot of adjustment of numbers. But if we use a predefined grid system and if we use something that is fully responsive, like Flexbox or CSS Flex, which is the same thing, right? It's just two different terms for the same thing. Then it's going to give us a simpler alternative that's going to make things a lot easier. And as you're learning Flexbox, for those of you who are in Web 2.15, you might have noticed there's a lot of code to it. Let me just stick this Flexbox slide up here. You might have noticed that there's a lot of things to define in CSS when you're defining your Flex properties. Right, you might define you're going to define the width of your different items. You might define the alignment of your different items, justification, number of columns, so on and so forth. Right, there's a lot of stuff to kind of deal with there. But one of the great things about using it within the constructs of Bootstrap is that we are able to take advantage of the work that's already been done for us within the framework to where we don't have to worry about a lot of that complex CSS code. We just get to apply the easy stuff that's already been done for us. So the flexible box module, which is also referred to as Flexbox, it was designed as this one-dimensional layout module. Right, basically we can take boxes and put them in a row right next to each other. If you remember back to Web 1.15, when we talked about the float property and how we could take items that we have, given an inline display property and allowed them to float next to one another. They all go in line to one another. But if they go off the edge of the page, that causes issues. If they need to shrink or expand, that causes issues. With our flexible box model, we have an instance where our boxes can grow and shrink. We have an instance where our boxes can wrap around to the next line, right? But we are kind of looking at it from the frame of references, or from the frame of reference of rows. Right, so we're looking at things from the frame of reference of rows. So we're kind of laying out items by row on our website, which is pretty neat. Right, that we can kind of think about it that way. And as we do our example, I'll kind of show you with colors and such how we kind of approach that problem. Just how it looks that way. But when we, what we're basically describing here is a one-dimensional layout. So we're thinking of things, in terms of rows, things wrapping around. And Bootstrap gives us the easy way to handle this. Now, in Bootstrap, we have a 12-column grid system. So we have this magic number, and the magic number is 12. So we're thinking about rows, And so we have a gridded system of rows and columns. So we can have as many rows on our page as we define, but we have 12 columns. That's the magic number of columns that we have on our page. Right, and this is actually based on an old school gridding system, right? Like, this is about as old school as we get when it comes to, you know, some of the earliest days when we were thinking about the way that we grid websites and coming up with a website grid. We based it around the number 960. 960. (960) divided by 12 is 80. Right? So we thought about things in terms of 80 pixel columns on a 960 pixel wide grid. And so if you look at things in like the early days of web design and web development, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, you see some of the earliest statically sized websites that we have laid out kind of using the same or a similar sort of alley system that we see today, where there's some sort of header, some sort of footer, and some sort of narrowed content box in the middle. This narrowed content box was always 960 pixels. And, you know, it was sort of a standardized size that could fit in basically every monitor that was available, right? Because most of the smaller monitors on the market in the early 2000s were 1024 by 768. So they were 1024 pixels wide. So your standard home monitor in the early 2000s was 1024 pixels wide. And so we built everything on a 960 pixel static grid because we could get everything into 12 columns of 80 pixels in a column. And it would all fit nicely into a window that was 1024 pixels wide. Right, we're just lucky that as monitors grew, standards improved, right? Because it would be a lot more difficult for us to deal with, kind of designing to that lowest monitor width nowadays if we still had to deal with everything in terms of static width, and putting, because we'd have to deal with cell phones nowadays. So like you'd have something that would have to look good on a cell phone versus something that would also have to, be seen on a 4K monitor. And we actually saw that a lot, before responsive web design became the norm. You would see these, massive, 1920 by 1080, these 1080p displays became more common. Right? 1024 to 960, not a huge deal. 960 to 1920, big difference, right? And so we would see these little narrow center boxes in the middle of these huge monitor layouts here, and it would look kind of weird. Right? So it would only get worse. And so, we adopted new standards for responsiveness. So we still have this 12-column grid system based on the 960-pixel grid system that was adopted back in the early 2000s, which is interesting. But the core concept of our Bootstrap grid system revolves around the idea of containers, rows, and columns. So we have one container that's going to contain every single thing, right? The rows that are going to define the rows of our grid system. And then each item in that grid system is going to have a specific number of columns that it will take up. And each of the items in each row will add up to 12, ultimately. Right, so if we start out with a container, right, we have a fixed container which responds to media query breakpoints for responsiveness, or we have a fluid container that responds to the parent width. And so just whatever container that we're dealing with here is what we're working with. So I'd like to go ahead and switch over to just a bit of a demonstration here. And I'd like to go ahead and just kind of start by just doing an entire walkthrough of kind of how a process or my process would go through. So I'd like to just start out by opening my command prompt. Because one of the ways that I might set up my environment typically might start with my command prompt. I might just do all this by hand, but I might do it this way as well. Just because this is easier and quicker sometimes. Right, I can go to E and I can CD into web 140. Might be that one. Yep. I can make a directory for Bootstrap. That's make dir for Bootstrap grid. And then we can CD into Bootstrap grid. Just some standard commands, and then I can run code dot to open VS Code in that folder already, so I don't have to, navigate to that folder when I open VS Code. Right, you can see over here on the left-hand side, it already has VS Grid or Bootstrap Grid open there. So I can create an index.html here. And I can go ahead and put a HTML skeleton in here using my exclamation point and Emmet to fill out the rest. So this will be Bootstrap grid. And so we'll visit getbootstrap.com so that we can do just that and get Bootstrap. So we'll click the download link here. And I will use the CDN file, so we'll get the CDN with JS deliver here. I'm just going to use the standard CSS distro, since for the purposes of this course, we don't need the JS. You might want to read through and use the JS. I'm not requiring you to use any of the JavaScript plugins here. But we'll just pop the link to the Bootstrap site in the CDN. Like so. So now if we put an H1 header on the site, and just put some text in that really quickly as we open that up, we see that it's sans serif. It's our Bootstrap font. Right, it's exactly what we're expecting here. So for the purposes of this demo, we'll go ahead and remove that out of there. And we'll go ahead and add our container here. Now, if we look through our documentation here, which is, again, as we kind of looked at in our pre-recorded video last week, that's kind of what I like to do. I like to look through the documentation and talk about the documentation. We can look through our documentation at the containers. I like using, container fluid's always going to be 100% width. If you want to have the sort of alleyway there, you can use the dot container. Which I think for our purposes here, I'm going to use dot container. But I want to apply that to my element here. So I'm going to put a main in here, a main. And remember that whenever we see dot in CSS, that's just the same as saying class in our HTML, container, and main in there just like that. And so that's how we start off by creating that container level. And so now that we have the container level, it understands that, okay, everything in the background is going to be or everything that's going to be whatever else, right, is going to be, inside of this is inside of something that is a Bootstrap container. So it's going to understand our Flexbox properties a little bit better than it would otherwise. If we want to, for our purposes as well, here we can look at the colors, right? For example, on the body here, I can put a class equals dark, so we can see that dark color. We can put the light here for the main. Or I might actually be using the and we can also use all these color values here as well. As SAS values. Looks like they've changed this up just a little bit. But we could probably still make this primary. Because I think it used to be like primary-BG, something like that, would give you a different background color. But it appears they've changed this up just a little bit in their most recent version. So BG dash. Instead of dash BG. Yeah, there we go. BG dash dark. And then we go BG dash light here. All right. There we go. Just slipped my line there for a moment. Now we should be good. We don't have anything for our container yet, since it doesn't have anything in it, right? It doesn't have a height defined by default. So once we start adding things to it, it'll give us a little bit of height here. We can test that just by putting a little bit of text in it so it has a little bit of a container size to it, right? So if we put a little bit of color or put a little bit of text in it, we see that it has we have a container here, and we can see that it is not quite full width, but we see if we manipulate our width here, we can see it jumping at various breakpoints with media queries until it becomes full width at mobile size. And remember also that if we want to, we can also add regular old CSS to our style sheets as well, right? So, or to our pages as well that we're using Bootstrap with, just like we would anything else. So if I save that and I add a style.css here, in here I can add a main, and I can add a min height here. And I can add a, 30 VH or something like that to it. And that'll solve that issue of, needing some text in there or needing something inside of that container for us to continue, right? Because we've given it a height. Now, so that looks pretty good. So that's the first of our 3 parts that we need for our CSS grid system. The first of our 3 parts is our container. If we look back at that slide, we said we have containers, rows, and columns. So those are that's our container. So now we have rows. And so we have a horizontal group of columns placed in a singular container. So we define a row that we can put other items into, and that creates our containers. And in these rows, we add basically our containers up to 12. And that gives us what we need there. We add our columns up to 12, and that gives us what we need. So inside of we can look at our documentation here. If we look at our documentation, we can specifically find, it has its own section. Let's see if we can find it here before we search for it. About the grid. There it is. So we can see that we have a class of row. We have a class of row, and that's going to define a singular row. So one of the things that you'll notice, right, in all of the documentation for Bootstrap here is that, everything's done in divs, right? And one of the things that we've talked about previously, I don't like to do a lot of stuff in divs. I like to do stuff with semantic tags. So I would use maybe section here to create this, and we define a class of row. And now we have a row, right? And so everything that we're going to put in this row goes inside of here. Now we can also define a height here. So we can kind of give this a tall or a short. Like, I'm kind of coming up with this in terms of kind of what I want to do here. So, you know, I'm kind of devising the tall and short. Dot tall. I can give it a min height of maybe 40 VH. Dot short. I can give it a min height of maybe 10 VH, right? And so by default, I've just given these rows just some heights based in my CSS here. Right, so now we can add some columns to these, right? And so what we want to do is we want to have columns that are in each of these rows, and each of these rows we're going to add up to 12 in terms of columns. Right, so we don't want to exceed 12 in a row because each row, a full row is 12 columns wide. We can do less than 12, but ideally we want to make it equal 12. One of the things that's actually kind of been introduced more recently is the idea of just the call COL class. So I will do, let's do these in articles. Article class equals call, COL. And so just the call class there is a fluid column. So I could have one of these, or I could have two of these, or I could have 12 of these in a singular row, and it's just going to kind of adjust to take up space. Now, I don't have any styling on these, so let me style my articles here really quickly. Border 2px dashed green, just so we can kind of see it stand out. So there we can see these items, right? So that's just my fluid columns. And so if I add more columns to this row where I'm just using these class equals COL, I can add as many as I want, really, just so long as I don't exceed 12, right? And they're just going to flow and resize accordingly. Right, so I added a couple more there. You know, I had 2, I added 3 more. Now I have 5 there, and you see they all just kind of shrunk down. They're all still in the same row. Right, so I have as many as I want there, basically. Which is pretty cool, right? Like that's something that's useful. You know, which is great compared to kind of the way it was done, where everything needed to be a specific column width back in older versions of Bootstrap. They've got this dynamic call now, which is really nice. But I can also define a number value here. Right, so if I say call-8 here, that's going to be an 8 out of 12. That's going to be 8 out of 12 with column. So if I look here now, my second column here is my call-8. So this one here is just call. So since it's my dynamic call, it's taking up the rest of the space. So in this case is acting as a call-4. If I defined this as something specific that does not equal 12, say a call-2, Right now I have a call dash 2 and a call dash 8. That doesn't equal 12 now, right? We see I have some leftover space on the end. That's another call dash 2. So I could either fill that space with another call. I could leave that space empty if I don't need anything there. Or I could switch this second article to either just a plain old call to the dynamic call that will allow it to expand out and fill the entire space. Or I can switch it to a call 10 because that's going to do the exact same thing for me. And when we get into SCSS a little later on in the semester, we can actually write a function that will kind of show you how all this works on the back end, which is kind of interesting. Right, but I can basically make a layout this way. I can make it quickly and easily, right? So if I decide, okay, I want to kind of play with this first column, make it some varying width, and make this second column take up the rest of the space. I can take that second column, give it the class of call, make it the dynamic call, make the first one, give it some kind of static value to where the first one has a predefined value, the second one has the dynamic value so it'll fill in. And then we can see as I resize my window as well, like it's dynamically resizing. It is responsive, which is nice. I can give it the colors that are in my theme colors, right, if I want to. Right, so we can get rid of, for example, we can get rid of the border there if we wanted to maybe add a background like BG info to this as well. So I might add a BG-info background there to that element. Which I don't think I saved my CSS file, but that is fine. Now we'll save that CSS file, and that should give us that. Right, so I could also put, text or whatever we need to in these items, right? They're just items that are in the section. The section becomes the row. Right, so this might be, H1, main article, with a paragraph of some random article text. Right, we can kind of end up with some really interesting stuff here. And so again, I can do things like that. I can basically do kind of however I want to do things. Right, so if I look at my second article here, or my second row here that I've built, which will kind of add some spaces here, so when you all are looking at this later, you have a better understanding of kind of what's going on. We can get really specific. With what we do here, just so long as we make sure everything adds up. So I can say, okay, 3 and 5 and 1. So 3 plus 5 plus 1, that's 9, right? So that leaves me with 3 left over. And let's give these some different colors. Warning. alert, and primary. Alert must not be one. What is the alert name? Danger. Danger. That's the one I wanted. Warning, danger, and primary. So there we see those colors. Right, and just so that doesn't run into that one, let's pick a different one for that one. Let's go success, right? We haven't used success. So let's go BG success. And so we can see what we're working with here, right? This is a 3 wide column. This is a 5 wide column. This is a 1 wide column. This is a 3 wide column. Right? All of those together added up equals 12. So it is the full width. If for some wild reason we do something that goes over, right? So if I change that to a column 4, so now it's 13 instead of 12. If we go back to our site, we see messes up, goes a little wild on us there. Not exactly something that we want to do, right? Because it takes and it wraps around that last column to the next line. So one of the things that might get you around that is if you know, like, okay, everything on this row, I want it to be all on this row. Well, you can always have that last one just be dynamic, right? And just take up the rest of the space that's left. So that might be a good way to kind of get around that. And work around that. And just because you start using the grid, it doesn't mean you always have to use the grid, right? I could just, I can move on from here. Create a new section as long as I don't add the class of row onto the section or the classes of columns onto anything inside of that section. It's not going to use that grid. Right? So it's just going to keep on going and doing what it's doing, right? So there is that. And I mean, another interesting thing that you can kind of work with here is that I can create. So watch what I'm going to do here, right? So I'm going to create this. I'm going to give this a class of row, but I'm also going to give it a class of container dash fluid. So I'm going to give it a full width container, but I'm also going to make it a row. So it is a part of this container, but it is now its own container. So I've put a flex, so I'm basically putting a flexbox container inside of a flexbox container. Right? And this is where things might start get confusing, right? Because now inside of here, I can put another section or another article, right? But inside of that section, I can give that a class of row. And I can also give it a call dash 6. That's one of those things where, like, when you get into things and you get going, the deeper you get, just so long as you're paying attention, right, you can start doing more and more stuff there with it. Let's see here. And it is a little tough to see. Let me add a little of that in there, just so you can see it there. Yeah, because that one didn't have a height to it. Right, so let me give, so now you can see that there. So let me add a little, yeah, let me make sure that this is tall. We'll just add a little tall here as well. Tall here, and tall here, just so you all can see this as well. But there you can see that subdivided grid. You see that it doesn't go all the way quite to the edge, which might pose a problem for you, but it is a subdivided grid that is contained on my page, right? Like I have a whole nother item that's over here that is half the page, that is this other section here, that's this other row that is also part of this grid, which is part of this grid, right? We could just go down the rabbit hole here, right? Which is a lot of fun. So let's make sure we have this ready to go for get. So we'll run get init here, get add everything, get add period, get commit -m initial commit. And I'll do the push after the live stream today when I get my GitHub set up for this. But I do have one more thing for us to talk about today, and that is a bit of a challenge that I'd like for you all to kind of think about for extra credit. So I have some markup files on GitHub. It's at github.com/DERamsey/challenge1. And I'll pull those up here. github.com/DERamsey/challenge1. Right, there's an index file here that's ready to go. There is a script file here that has absolutely nothing in it. And there's a CSS file in it that has just a little bit of something in it. That's at github.com/DERamsey/challenge1. And what I'd like for you all to do is to just kind of go crazy with this site with Bootstrap. To just customize it as much as possible. And I'd like for you to send me a link to the to your live version of the site via email by the end of the module, so by midnight Thursday. And I will give you some extra credit. I will give you, let's say, an extra 100. Why not? I'll give you an extra 100 for the course, for extra credit. So you're allowed to do whatever you want to the site. Just, clone it or pull it down with GitHub. Change it with Bootstrap. Make whatever changes you want to make with it. Push it up to your own GitHub. Make it a live site on GitHub pages. Send me a link to the GitHub pages with it live by midnight Thursday. and I will give you some extra credit. You know, the best way to learn a lot of this stuff, especially with Bootstrap, is to just sit down and practice it. So getting some more practice in is not going to hurt us. So doing some extra credit here is going to be a good thing for us. So let's add that to our agenda for this week. So that's all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you for watching. We will kind of turn the music back on and hang out and chat for just a minute, just in case anybody who's watching live has any questions. But that's all that I have for you for this week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.